Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cologne and our fourth session of our Safety Week, Ramp Up Safety Week, specifically for ATOs. My name's John Franklin. I'm Head of Safety Promotion here at EASA. And I'm going to hand over shortly to my colleague Dan Ducey. But just before we start the session itself, it's worth just giving you a quick introduction to Safety Week. So back at the end of May, we launched this Ramp Up campaign with a package of material that's available on our AirOps community site to help organisations prepare for the ramp up of operations. So there's lots of resources, links to information provided by all sorts of organisations for the ramp up, and hopefully things you'll find useful. And then obviously this week we're having a series of different domain sessions with different organisations talking about some of the challenges they're facing, and hopefully to start continue an open and honest and interesting discussion about how we get through this ramp up together as an industry. So I'll hand straight over to my colleague Dan Ducey, who's going to be the moderator of the session. Dan.
Yeah, thank you, John. So good morning, everyone. So I have the pleasure of moderating this session focused on training organizations. Our section, so the one that I represent, is dealing normally with rulemaking, the implementation, standardization between member states in the area of flight crew licensing, medical certification, FSD qualifications. As you can see on screen, we provided some links there to some of the items that we prepared specifically for training organizations during the pandemic, which were developed in close collaboration with the national aviation authorities, and that helped to provide some support in terms of alleviations to the training organizations through, for example, enabling virtual classroom training and some alleviations in the sense of regulatory timeframes. Going to the next slide, just a quick show of the current situation. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel, also for those in the training sites, and hope we can show you some of those during today's session, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we are moving in a direction that is positive for all. The next slide. So this session then, we're going to look at the possible skill and knowledge degradations as well as the well-being concerns that have been raised as regards both the students and instructors at flight schools as a result of COVID, and in particular the periods of inactivity that have led to reduced or limited operations caused by the health safety measures imposed to these training organizations, as well as, of course, the wider aviation framework that they operate in. So if we go to the next slide, as regards to today's panelists, so in order for us to allow to contrast between the varying impacts that we have seen, we've tried to bring a selection of training organizations from different parts of Europe, different regions, as well as some different ATOs, for example, some that have a link to an operator, others that have multiple training sites across Europe or outside of Europe, for instance, in the United States. So with this, I'm really happy to present to you the panelists on screen. We're going to start off with Colin Rydon, who's representing the Pilot Flight Academy based in Norway. We have Bartholomew Wallace, also I will refer to him as Bart, from Bartolini Air Base based in Poland. Lewis Martens from the FTE Jerez based in Spain. Sauli Korti from the Finnish Aviation Academy based in Finland. And last but not least, Carl O'Neill, being the representing the Aer Lingus ATO based in Ireland. So with that, I think we can move on to our first panelist, Colin Rydon. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dan, and a very good morning to everybody. If you'd like to go to the first slide for me, Dan. Just a brief introduction. This isn't quite accurate, but I'm currently the CEO and COO of Pilot Flight Academy, which is a training organization based in Norway. Previously, I held the title of Vice President Training with L3 Harris, and before that, I spent most of my life in the airlines, holding various senior management positions at Flybe, Jetstar, Qantas, EasyJet, and British Airways. So through my time, I've probably spent over 10,000 hours of flying, a lot of the time in a desk or in a simulator, as I was a TRI, TRE and senior examiner on a number of fleets, Boeing and Airbus. And finally, I did an MBA at Henley and am a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. So hopefully I bring a reasonably broad background in aviation to the panel today. Next slide, please. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Pilot Flight Academy, if we can go into the next slide. We are based in Norway. We have 2 bases in Norway. We established in 2007. We have around about 400 students from around 15 countries. We have been predominantly based in the Nordic region, but over time we're seeing more students come from further afield. And we also have a number of cadet pilot programs from airlines, one airline being All Nippon Airways. And so we're probably one of the larger flight academies in Europe. And our focus has always been on high quality of training. So we've put a lot of effort into our flight instructor community. We've grown that significantly to around 60 flight instructors, with many of those holding MEIRI qualifications. And we do predominantly within our integrated ATPL course a large number of multi-engine hours. So we do a total of 106 multi-engine hours in our program, because that's where we feel the focus can be better placed to prepare our pilots for a multi-crew flight deck. If we go into the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have 2 bases in Norway, in Torp Sandefjord and Tuven Notodden. But we also have our base in Texas, in the USA at Denton. We are planning on opening a new base in mainland Europe in 2021. And as I mentioned, we predominantly offer integrated ATPL courses, with our single engine flying content being in the USA, but then our multi-engine back in Europe. So we operate a fleet of around 30 aircraft and 6 simulators, and have our own Part 145 and camo facility. And one of the unique areas we have, which is national student financing within Norway and also our fellow countries nearby us in terms of Finland and Sweden, where students can get financing without collateral to be able to undergo their training. Next slide, please. So the COVID-19 impact, all of us have had COVID-19 impact. The difference, I guess, with, say, airlines, which came to a stop, with us as ATOs, we had to carry on going, and it was how we actually could do that within regulations that our governments imposed upon us. So if I go to the next slide. So we had some enforced closures at the ATO. We had one which was for a period of 4 months in 2020, and one which was a month just recently in April of this year. They were slightly different in both. The first lockdown was very much the whole facility, whereas in April recently it was only one of our locations in Torp, which was only really for no student flying. So we could still fly as an ATO, but not with our students, because it was based in the education program. We also had some challenges with Texas, with the US Embassy in Oslo closing for any visa applications, which prevented some of our students being able to go out to the US during that time. We obviously put in virtual learning environment for the ATPL ground school, and even today we're not fully back into the classroom learning environment. We're around 50-50 between classroom and virtual. There wasn't government support in as much as an organisation, but there was a furlough scheme to support us through those periods. We were away from the main city of Oslo, but of course a lot of our students travel, as well as our employees. We didn't have a large number of COVID cases, but we did have a number of small outbreaks, but we usually reacted pretty quickly with the help of public health in Norway to make sure that these outbreaks were isolated pretty quickly and prevented any spread. So it did mean at times having either a student or instructor in quarantine when we'd have these cases. Naturally, I think the motivation of both employees and students have been challenging. We've all experienced this, whether it's remote working, but being away from what you normally do for a long period of time. And for students, having to study remotely is very difficult as well. So we've definitely seen that as an impact. If we can go to the next slide. So looking at the sort of top safety issues we experienced, if you go into the next one, please. First one is challenges on return to flying. Each time we had one of those lockdown periods, and clearly the students' progress had been halted, but each student is very different, as we know. So how much learning they've retained, whether they've continued their studies, but either way, there's been that lack of continuity, which is quite difficult to get back into. I think a common one as well, people who've been away from flying for a period of time, it's quite tiring going back into that flying environment. Naturally, we completed a full risk assessment to look at all the challenges we might face, what extra training we need to put in, what support we needed to put in, working with public health as to what was as safe and practical to make it as safe as possible. So we looked at restriction of numbers of students on site. We had border restrictions, which was a challenge as well, because some of our students and employees went home with the government lockdown and then couldn't get back in. So that added an extra complication, as well as our international students who were still allowed in, having to go through isolation and finding locations for them to isolate in. Virtual classroom activities bring their own challenges. Hard work for the instructor, not having that face-to-face engagement, difficult for students to stay motivated. So that's very difficult in itself, and it's how you approach that, and so on and so forth, and transitioning back into classroom behaviour. And controlling student behaviour, that's a real challenge at all times, especially within a COVID pandemic, where we're trying to restrict students mixing, socialising, so that we can control the spread of COVID and make sure it stayed away from our academy locations. Next slide, please. So some of the, oh, is there one before that you just jumped over? Can you just go back one? Thank you. So keeping COVID secure, I think pretty much everyone has adopted similar things, but we obviously had the hand sanitizer at every entrance. We looked at we looked at mask wearing. We came to a decision with public health that it was better to wear masks within the operating environment, so all indoors and in aircraft and simulators, which took some getting used to, I think, for all, but eventually people felt comfortable in doing this. Some temperature checking, we did that mostly in the US, and we limited our numbers within planning rooms, other rooms, and we made sure we did full cleaning of the aircraft between flights and then a deep clean overnight. All non-essential staff we kept away from the academy, so remote working, and in the theoretical ground school we kept it to virtual classroom through the toughest periods. We also introduced COVID testing on site, which is thanks to public health. So anytime we did have an outbreak, we could bring them in, offer testing for all students and instructors to give them some level of assurance. Next slide, please. So having got our academies COVID secure, having looked at the risks and how we get back to flying safely, clearly the other challenge is skills and knowledge retention, and every student having a different attitude to this. So training continuity at this stage of training, as I'm sure you all appreciate, is critical for a student to improve and to retain their knowledge. Gaps in an integrated program is not ideal. So it's quite hard to mitigate against, because it's very difficult to find the right solution for each individual. And obviously maintaining motivation, really tough during that period. So what we looked at was every individual. So we looked at individual refresher training as it was required, dependent on the stage of training and where they were. So very different for a student building up to their first solo to a student completing their IR flying. So we had to review that more on an individual basis rather than a total one. And same with the instructors, really. And at least with the instructors, we have the capability of refreshing within the simulator and in remote team sessions and things like that. So there were probably a number of options we utilized in helping our instructors back to flying. But as we mentioned before, one of the key issues was actually just going back to flying was a tiring experience. Next slide, please. Mental health and well-being, that's probably one of the biggest issues from all of the lockdowns we've seen. We've certainly seen that being a challenge in a number of countries within Europe. We do have two distinct groups. They are different: instructors, employees, students. We feel it's more of an issue for students because of their financial concerns due to delays in training, what's going to happen in terms of employment prospects. And so they haven't been able to fully engage in the fun of learning to fly. It should be fun, and with mask wearing and not being able to socialize as much, more private study, that's a lot of challenge. And it is hard to stay motivated in your self-studies in that virtual learning environment for a long period. And so it was more of a motivational challenge for instructors rather than a mental health and well-being one for them. So motivated to get back into work, maintain their standards, etc. One thing we did do is we introduced a peer support program. So whilst peer support programs have been rolling out across airlines, it's a little different within the ATO sector, as we know, because our students transition so quickly. So it's quite difficult doing peer-to-peer. So we selected two of our younger, less experienced flight instructors who had the skills we felt for this to become peer support people to actually help and be there for any students or any instructors, and to be able to signpost them to help or just be there to support and listen. So we developed our peer support program in conjunction with the Public Health Service in Norway to roll that out to help people through this period. Next slide, please. So lessons learnt, that's okay, you can go to the next one, thank you. These are some of the lessons learned. We, as an ATO, maintaining communication was critical. Teams at least makes this very easy. There's many other tools, of course, but that certainly made things easier. But also having one-to-one discussions we felt were really important, especially in terms of making sure students were progressing and maintaining their motivation. The idea of the challenges of mental health, especially in a virtual learning environment, especially being on your own, really important. So the peer support program for an ATO, I think, is really important. It's just how you approach it in a different way. Certainly on shutdown of a school, one thing maybe we didn't consider fully whilst doing a management of change is how you continue the management of the ATO where you shut down all operations for 4 months, because clearly you still have audits to perform, or you need to reschedule, or you have regular safety management meetings. So how do you maintain the ATO going through a period where you have completely shut down and where employees have been furloughed? Having virtual learning approved was really useful and something that we'll have for the future should we ever undergo such circumstances again. But equally, we've gained a lot of feedback from that virtual learning classroom and how we can maybe use that, working with the ASA and authorities to see how maybe we adapt our integrated programs in the future and how we can get a better balance of teaching and learning, classroom-based and virtual-based, with the feedback we've gained from this. And it's really important, obviously, to work closely with our authority and maintain good dialogue. And we did that very much as a team on a weekly basis with a weekly call with our authority, which we found extremely useful, given that they couldn't travel, they couldn't visit us. We had to get various approvals in place. So at least by maintaining that virtual relationship on a weekly basis, we were still able to progress as an ATO. Next slide, thank you. So just one little quick slide here on virtual classroom feedback. If you go to the next slide, just in terms of how well prepared our students felt out of a group of 77 we questioned, you can see not all one way. They generally felt slightly less prepared for their exams in the virtual environment than in the classroom environment, but they felt reasonably prepared from the training they had received. But they didn't feel they're likely to fail their exams as a result of virtual learning. So results were quite close. We did further questions within that feedback, but it shows there is a place for virtual learning, but we need to get it right. And hopefully with some of the feedback we can take across the ATOs, we can feed that back into EASA as to how we can maybe amend course syllabus in the future. Next slide, please. I think the next slide might just be a duplicate, so if you go to the next one, please. And that is everything from me. So thank you for your time. I enjoyed talking about it, and I look forward to any questions later.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for providing us insight into how your Pilot Flight Academy managed the challenges across different operating sites, especially also the US. It's interesting to see that. As regards to student well-being, obviously this has been one of the major concerns during this period. To what extent do you believe that the peer support is able to address these well-being issues you have encountered?
I think it's very difficult to tell. The challenge is really getting someone to reach out, getting someone to have that first conversation, and then for the peer supporter to understand how they can signpost that individual. So it's really important, certainly I'm sure a lot of people know this, it's really important that the peer supporter isn't the person solving the problem. They are just there to be a sounding board and to listen and to be able to help direct an individual to the right sort of help they may need. So sometimes, yes, indeed, that might just be for a conversation, but this is a challenge of mental health. It comes in so many different forms. And so it's really making sure that our peer supporters have the right training and support in place, that they understand how they can signpost someone to the help they might need, to the professionals. So really, my hope is that within having peer support and having the trust within that program, that all students, instructors and employees feel comfortable in reaching out to those individuals, knowing that it's fully confidential, and that hopefully those peer supporters have appropriate training to be able to help them go to the help they need. That's really what I hope for, because certainly we know it's been a challenge over the last couple of years for a lot of people.
All right, thank you, Colin. So that it's clear peer support is going to play a crucial role in this during this time, and maybe also for in the future we should really build on this experience gained and see what else we can do with peer support programs in future. Moving in, thank you, Colin. Moving to a colleague from Barthélemy Air. Bart, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this seminar. So just quickly about the company. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. That's quickly about myself. Yeah, I'm currently one of the founder of Barthélemy, and I'm the president of the Barthélemy Group, which is made of several companies. For one as a large ATO in Poland. I will tell a bit more about the company, this ATO, in a moment. I'm an instructor and examiner as well, and I'm also a line check captain on citation transfer, because one of our companies also dealing with corporate flight operations. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so who we are at Barthélemy. We are a company founded in 2006. Oh, a little bit too fast. Let's come back, please. Okay, thank you. So we are a company founded in 2006. We are currently the larger ATO in Poland with about 22,000 operations a year, about 200 pilots trained every year as well. Basically with two bases. Our major base is in Lodz, Echo Papa Lima Lima, and the second base in north east of Poland, Echo Papa Sierra Yankee. where we also operate from the beginning of that year. We have 14 aircraft, all very modern aircraft equipped with FS. The average 9 single engine TECNAMs. Lost contact. Okay, 9 single engine TECNAMs, 4 twin engine TECNAMs. So as you can see, a majority of TECNAM fleet, and also in the new generation for LPA3 training. That was actually the first Cap 10C NG produced by Robin from the moment they resumed production of that fantastic aircraft. Trilators, FNPT2, for APS MCC training, and 2006 TECNAM replica for our IAT training. We train pilots from 0 to NRAD ready. We do modular training as well as integrated training. We are also a Ryanair training partner within the so-called Ryanair Mentor program, where we train pilots for that particular company from scratch. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one important thing I would like to mention is that we're not directly affected by lockdown in Poland, because the aviation training was continued almost normally during the pandemic. Of course, we're facing some problems with border restrictions, cancelled examination sessions, and so on. But from the point of view of the currency of our instructors and the correct maintenance of our airplane, there were not too many threats. So our major issue that we see is with the quality of instructors that are on the market. Let me give you just a few words of history about the instructor market. Yeah, we all know from the pre-COVID market that there was a huge pilot shortage because of the high demand of airlines for pilots. And it's obvious that for a young pilot, the first choice of airliner flight deck rather than a position of an instructor. Also because the salaries of instructors were usually lower. Within this pilots, many of them would be willing to start as an instructor and then switch to an airliner, but they were afraid of missing the train. That's why very often very good potential instructors were becoming actually airline pilots, even they will be rather to start as an instructor to gain some more experience. It's very often the problem that we are facing, and I believe many ATOs were facing the same problem, is that the instructor was recruited from those pilots that has been rejected by the airlines for various reasons. Could be a lack of skills, knowledge, or simply an appropriate personality. But what I said, you cannot expect a good harvest if you don't sow with the best grain. And it's very important to have a very well-trained and very skilled instructors if you want to have very good pilots and at the end of the process, of the training process. And definitely in the pre-COVID market, instructor were the bottleneck for most ATOs. Next slide, please. So what happened now during COVID and early post-COVID market? Yeah, so obviously the pilot unemployment leads to surplus of FIs and pilots that wants to become FIs. But does it really help? Does it really solve the problem that we're having previously? Well, first of all, it's important to notice that flying an airliner is not the same thing as flying a GA aircraft, especially if you have to train someone. Okay, not the same skills are required from an instructor and from an airline pilot. Of course, you need to be a good pilot to be a good instructor, but you also need to know how to transmit your knowledge to the student. You need to have this something needed by a good instructor. Remains whether that person will stay once the industry will recover, because in my opinion there is no point about it. The industry will recover. The question is simply when. And again, how to motivation of people applying to become an FI in a company. It's very difficult knowing the number of applications. I will show you in a moment some figures of our own company, and you will see that the situation has changed dramatically on that regard as well. Now, does it make sense to invest in an FI if you're unable to understand the real motivation? And obviously, that's the problem, okay? If you hire an FI, you need to invest in that person. It's not just about the FI rating itself. There's a lot of extra training that has to be done. Standardization, absolutely a key point, in my opinion, for any instructor. And all this requires time, money, and efforts from the ATO point of view. Now, the question is also, is the candidate knowledge up to date and appropriate for the position? Remember that many pilots were doing any kind of jobs in order to survive, obviously, and they simply lost their skills or their knowledge. They need to be up to date with the current knowledge required to be an instructor. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our own example. If we compare the number of applications between 2019 and 2020, there is a dramatic change. In 2019, we have no spontaneous application. No one has applied to become an FI spontaneously. Okay. Now, in 2020, 108 FI spontaneous applications. That shows the complete change of the market. Concerning people that wanted to become an FI, we were having only one application from a wannabe FI in 2019, where today we are receiving 63 applications during the last 12 months. Also, the way we treat now the problem is slightly different. We're having 5 applications for FI from an advertised campaign, okay? And we have selected 3 of them, trained them, and hired as instructors to become up. There's a problem with the slide. Could you just come back to the previous slide, please? Not that one. Next one. And the very next one. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Oh, too fast. Okay, great. Okay, so 3 FIs has been selected in 2019, trained and hired by the company. Today, we have trained in 2020 5 FIs. We have selected them, trained them. However, we did not hire them yet because for the time being, we don't need extra instructors. However, we have created a pool of instructors because it's obvious that at some point we'll need them. I will talk about a larger pool of instructors in a moment, but this is, in my opinion, a very important solution if you want to make sure that we'll have the number of instructors required once the situation will recover. Next slide. So we have identified 3 key risk factors related to that issue. First of all, the candidate applying may apply only because of the crisis on the airline market. So what's the real motivation? Yeah, is there any real motivation? How to judge that real motivation? Okay. Also, the risk of long-term and medium risk that the person will leave the company at the first opportunity. If they will start flying as an instructor and an airline will start hiring massively, there is a risk that all those instructors we have invested in will simply leave the company and will lose this human capital. The risk of lack of appropriate knowledge and skills. Again, if people are applying, and there is a lot of people applying, how we can judge the proper knowledge and skills of this potential instructors. Now, also, this may be an issue because people may be frustrated if they are not doing the job that they were expected to do. That many of the young pilots were trained or were expecting that they are training to become airline pilots. If they have to do a different job, they may be frustrated. That may create some issues, may have create some tensions inside of the company. Of course, behind this, there is a high pressure on the salaries. That's pretty obvious that people will also try to have larger salaries just because they need to leave. And that's absolutely acceptable and normal as long as this pressure does not become too strong. Another problem is also lack of relevant standards. It's important to notice that being an instructor is not the only thing that an instructor needs to do properly. He needs to have a proper standards, and standards are various depending on the flight schools. So if someone wants to hire an instructor from different flight school or simply an instructor with a restricted FI, there is an important, there might be an important problem with standards. Next slide. So of course, we should be able to mitigate most of this risk. How we can do that? First of all, we need a very well structured recruitment process. It's important to have a real HR department and proper tools to properly assess pilots. It's also important to create clear selection criteria to make sure that we know exactly what we are looking for. What is the profile of the candidate? What are we expecting from the candidate? In my opinion, it's also key to have aviation psychologists that support all this process. It could be an in-house subcontracted. In our case, we have an in-house aviation psychologist, and in my opinion, this is absolutely a key person in all this process to make sure that we are hiring the right people. Of course, the regulation policy has to be a long-term and transparent system. That will avoid this kind of situation that I was mentioning before with a high pressure on salaries. If we know exactly what to expect in the near future, people usually do not have tendency to have such a strong pressure on the salaries. We need also a very well developed standardization process. Shortcut absolutely something we should avoid. In absolutely no case we should use any kind of shortcuts. Standardization is absolutely, in my opinion, a key point. Every instructor needs to train the same way. Even if someone is coming, we do not let someone to start training as long as we are not sure that person meets the standards that we have established for the company. And of course, something which is obvious, but sometimes we tend to forget about it. Don't look for the cheapest solution. Don't hire someone just because he's willing to fly for or train for almost nothing, or sometimes even nothing. We had people applying and saying, I'm ready not to have any incomes for the next 6 months, for instance. Okay, that could be interesting as long as the person is good. But first of all, quality and standards are, in my opinion, key point, not the cost of the instructor. Next slide. Okay, another risk factor is the surplus of FIs and wannabe FIs on the market. Remember the figures I was showing. So of course, the low remuneration may lead to choosing the cheapest instructor or the best. That's one of the key points. We have to be very careful. Again, I mentioned this person that was that applied, saying that okay, I'm ready to fly for nothing for the first half a year. Okay, as I said, it could be something acceptable for some companies. We don't agree with this kind of solution, generally speaking, because we consider that everyone needs to be paid for the job he's doing. But I can understand that some companies may be interested by this kind of solution. But remember, don't take this as the key solution to select the proper instructor. Temptation to raise the pace, short-term financial gains over long-term quality. Again, it's not because we're in a crisis that we need to lower the salaries. It's very important to keep our resources in the company. At some point, the situation on the market will recover and we are going to need instructors. We should do everything possible to keep the instructors that we have in the company, not letting them leaving the company just because of short-term financial gains. Also, it's very important not to hire too many people, just in case, okay? Because again, as I said, we know that many people, that soon the situation will recover. Hiring people just in case is risky. Why? Because if we hire too many people, we will have some more problems, which I will explain in a moment on the very next slide. Now, another problem that we are encountering personally, could you come back for a second? You could come back for a second, thank you. Yeah, another problem that we're facing personally as a company is an overloaded HR department. We're receiving so many applications that it's really a problem for us to deal with all those applications. And there is related to this risk of selecting not a good potential FIs just because of too many applications. We can simply miss the right person within this that large number of applications. Okay, next slide. Okay, how we can mitigate this? Well, first of all, give priority to long-term solution versus short-term. That's absolutely obvious, but it's important to remember that. It's important also to keep your team motivated at the highest level possible. We do organize very frequent meetings with our team explaining the situation. And again, do not hide the reality. It's important to be clear in the explanation of the situation, of the company, of the market, and in the future needs that the company will have. Make realistic assessments of your future needs. That's important as well. And in order to avoid your HR department to be overloaded, it's absolutely key to have a filtering process, clear and legible criteria. As I said before, have access to an aviation psychologist. That will also help a lot to mitigate this kind of problems. Next slide. Okay, another risk, last risk, is to end up with an incorrect number of FIs due to the unpredictability of the market. We all know that the market is so unpredictable that it's very difficult today to make some forecast, but we have to do, and we have to try our best to do it. Okay. Frustration, which is related to this. Most of the instructors are paid per hour, and if they're not flying a lot, obviously they will not have enough incomes to survive normally. That's one of the key risks in that case. If you have too few instructors, that will lead to two different problems. First of all, an overload, related fatigue, and poor application of standards. And another problem will be how to hire. What we do when the market will suddenly recover. Yeah, we need to remember that the training process of an instructor is a relatively long process. The FI course itself takes time. Standardization training takes time. Altogether, we are talking about many months before a potential FI will become an active FI. And obviously, we need to predict what is going to happen in the near future. Next slide. Okay, how we can mitigate it? Well, first of all, a proper assessment of our possible need. Yeah, read about going on the market. Try to have as many information as you can to try to predict something which is, I believe, unpredictable partially, but many things may be predicted based on what we can learn from the last months. Assess your need, okay, and make sure that you don't have any other bottlenecks. If you hire too many instructors, you don't have enough aircraft, obviously the bottleneck will be somewhere else. So it's very important to make sure that we know where are the bottlenecks and how we can deal with the problem. Priority to standardization versus temptation of incomes. Again, we are all, as any company, tempted to have to increase our incomes. That's normal for a commercial company, but standardization should be absolutely a key issue, and this should never become a second after this temptation, because if we are lacking standardization, the quality of the training will definitely suffer, and in long term, obviously, that will also have an influence on the company financial condition. Now, adjust your employment policy to the new situation and be flexible. That's also important, to be extremely flexible. If the market is changing, we need to also change the market. Create a pool of FIs. This is what we have decided to do in Bartolineer, is to train pilots, instructors ready on the kind of pool. And as soon as situation will recover, we'll start employing those people. They know the situation. This is not a surprise for them. From the very beginning, we clearly told them, listen, we are creating this pool. If you're interested, we are ready to train you, but we never know when we will be ready, or maybe in 6 months time, maybe in 2 years time. That's something we cannot predict. So, but again, the message has to be clear, and the person needs to know what to expect in that regard. Okay, next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bart, for your presentation. I mean, it was really interesting to see that you had actually a limited impact on your operations, and that in turn you had multitude of instructor applications, but at the same time you remained focused on quality, and you even came up with this pooling concept that you mentioned there. In the interest of time, we'll come back to maybe the instructors during the Q&A at the end. So I'd like to move on to Louis Martins. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Louis. I'm here representing FT Jerez. Next slide, please. Our core business is ab initio pilots training. We are based in the south of Spain, and we do all of our training on campus, including having the students here accommodated throughout the whole duration of their training, which lasts about 62 to 65 weeks. Next slide, please. Now, my name is Louis Martins. As I said, I am the CTKI. I'm the head of ground school here at FT Jerez. My background is in aeronautical engineering and working in the military. I've been an instructor for 11 years now, and regarding my collaboration with EASA, I was fortunate enough to be able to work with rulemaking task that updated the ATPL syllabus just a couple of years ago. And currently, I also work as a question writer for EASA. Next slide, please. Now, I share the impact that the pandemic had on our ATO I shared it with pretty much all of our colleagues here. It's pretty much the same challenges regarding all ATOs. Next slide, please. So the impact directly was we had to stop the flying activity for 12 weeks. We had to move our ground school completely to the virtual classroom, and because, as I said, we have the students living with us, we actually not all students could return to their countries and to their houses, to their homes. So we actually had to manage students living on campus, quarantining on campus during this period. Next slide, please. So the challenges themselves, we had some that were common to everyone, okay, such as the impact of the measures to ensure health safety. Now, on these, we had there was the impact on the personal life of the people, having to wear masks, all the care, the worries about ensuring that everyone is safe. Next slide, please. Next point. And of course, the industry uncertainty. That was the biggest one, and that was the one that I think everyone is covering, and quite correctly, because this had a massive impact both on our students and our instructors. Because as just my previous colleague was saying, the flight instructor career for a considerable amount of the instructors is a step to the next career. And the fact that the industry went to this crisis took that goal from the near future, and that had an impact on their motivation and the way they face their job as well. Next point, please. Now, specific to the instructors, our worry was if there was going to be any decaying skills over a long period of inactivity. Now, we were kind of lucky because most of our instructors did not stop more than 12 to 20 weeks. So there was not much of an issue with decaying skills. Next point, please. Regarding our students, we didn't see any decay in skills that was unusual or that we're not used to dealing with. But the biggest impact, as my colleagues have been saying, was clearly on their motivation and stress levels. Now, the health measures that we had to put in place are a constant and very visual reminder of the crisis that we're going through, of the pandemic. And that increased everyone's stress levels, be it going to a flight or when they return, or going to the classroom. And the motivation, as we said before, of going from a world where they basically had a job almost certain at the end, to this world now, some of them even losing the funding that they had, or part of the funding they had insured when they started the training. All of those things affect their levels of stress and their motivation. And of course, these things have impact on how they prepare for the flights, on how they prepare for the study, on all those things, on what they prioritized. Next slide, please. Now, what were the lessons learned? And this is what I want to focus on the most, because this was a unique situation that we had never lived through. So we had to learn as we go. We did the best we could at every given step, I think. But the most important thing, as I will explain next, is to keep learning. Next slide, please. Now, the first thing, to address an eventual decay in the skills of the flight instructors returning, what we did was currency check every single instructor that came back, regardless of the period of time it was out and regardless of it being required or not. We did a currency check led by the CFI, which allowed us to see how their skills were and also how their motivation and if their head was back in the game. And we can say happily that we didn't have any issues bringing back our instructors once we restarted the flying activity. Next point, please. Now, to address the students' stress and motivation issues, well, we learn is that knowing what is happening is half the battle. So we strongly reinforce the feedback collection tools that we had. Now, the feedback that we used to collect used to be by phases. So, for example, once they completed ground school, we would collect feedback regarding that phase of training. When they would complete flying training, we'd collect feedback regarding that phase of training. And when we completed the MCC, we do it as well. But those were collected by the head of ground school, myself, the chief flying instructor, and the head of training directly, and then passed to customer service. Now, what we did during the pandemic was we worked to reinforce the importance of talking to the students committee that we have, structure led by students that we have in place. And also we introduced a new form of feedback, which is collected directly by the customer service instead of collected by the training departments and then sent to them. Why? Because we noticed there was a perceived difference between what we were seeing on campus and what was showing up on the feedback. And we were left wondering if some students were not holding back because just like because they like their instructors, and also because they might have fear that this would have an impact on their training in a moment in time where getting a job it's looking like it's going to be considerably difficult. Now, from the feedback we collected, we kept improving, and we kept even decisions we made before. We said, well, if that's not working, let's try. And that's the biggest advice and biggest lesson learned is don't stick to the first decisions. Keep learning, keep consulting, keep getting information. Next point, please. Now, one of the biggest changes we had was clearly the paper-based, going from a paper-based structurally mostly to paperless. And we had this, it's one of those things I imagine everyone shares with us, which is we had most of these things planned, but we kept delaying because we kept being dragged to the day-to-day stuff that happens. This forced us to have to go and make those changes. And I can say quite proudly that just recently we had one of our first audits by our NAA that was run completely remotely, and it was something that worked really well. Now, yes, we're back. Regarding the virtual classroom, and I'll talk a little bit more after the presentation, it is a great solution with great limitations. It is better than just having the students self-study, but it's not a replacement to face-to-face instruction because, and this is one of the biggest lessons learned from this pandemic, next point please, human contact remains an unbeatable asset in training, especially in this world of training in aviation that we are trying to make more competency-based. So to train our students to evaluate their different competencies, the core competencies, to do a thorough and rich knowledge, skills, and attitude assessment. Face-to-face training, being in the classroom with the students remains unbeatable. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the future, next slide. Now, the biggest impact of the pandemic regarding the future was in 2019, pilot recruitment was clearly an employer market rather than an employee market, with the airlines having to compete for candidates. Now, we can already see some good signs ahead, but there is going to be a cost to this pandemic. And the cost that we see was all the benefits we were collecting before from having this unprecedented demand for pilots brought huge benefits for ATOs and future pilots. There were more and more airlines jumping in earlier on the training, sponsoring cadets, mentoring cadets. We also saw airlines offering better type rating deals. Now, these things were decreasing the overall cost of becoming a pilot, or at the very least, making it a safer investment. Now, which made the career accessible to a larger amount of people and had a direct consequence in the average quality of the student pilots, which increased significantly, I can assure you. What I hope is that the airlines learn something from that period in terms of the quality of the candidates they can get if they get involved at the beginning of the training, because Otherwise, it's back to selecting from those who can afford it rather than the best candidates. And while it is expensive and risky to sponsor a student, I think experience has proven that it ensures better outcomes on the type ratings, base trainings, the line trainings that come onwards. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward for your questions.
So thank you, Lewis. Thank you for presenting a very good presentation from Flight Training Europe. So I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points you raised there, but given your background in the theoretical knowledge instruction, specifically your involvement in some of the rulemaking activities on the theory, when it comes to your statement saying virtual classroom being a great solution with some limitations, could you maybe expand a little bit on the face-to-face versus virtual classroom training with regard to challenges and examples?
Yes, of course. So as I said, virtual classroom is an excellent tool, and just like in any tool, if used adequately. Having the virtual classroom tool will allow us, for example, to have a shirt and a tie and wear pajama bottoms on as a conference. More relevant.
Yeah.
Used as an alternative to face-to-face instruction for a short period of time, quarantine periods, for example, as we lived through over the last years, it is an amazing tool and much better than just having them study by themselves. It allows us to still teach. It allows them to have a direct contact and a direct channel to the instructor, to ask questions, to participate as much as they can. But it is not the same thing as face-to-face by a long stretch. As I said before, direct human interaction remains paramount, especially when we are trying to move our training to a competency-based training approach. So for short periods, for revision, for the students to even keep a video record of something, of a lecture, not a lesson, which is different, it's great. But on the long term, I still think that face-to-face interaction, being able to read the facial expressions, being able to see directly how the students are assimilating, it remains unbeatable.
Okay, thank you, Lewis, for providing that insight, and I'm sure that we'll see more virtual classroom usage also after the pandemic, of course, once it's over. So, and we'll come back to this issue maybe also towards the end of the session. So, with that in mind, just to highlight to the audience that we have a Q&A feature inside this webinar. So, feel free to ask your questions on the side, and we'll try to address some of them at the end of the session, time permitting. So, thank you, Lewis. Moving on to Sauli Korti of the Finnish Aviation Academy. Sauli.
Yes, thank you, Don. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank EASA for inviting me to share some experiences and lessons learned from a mid-size ATO perspective. Next slide, please. Just a few words. I've been working for the Finnish Aviation Academy for the past 22 years, a member of an EASA Flight Standards Technical Committee. And to save some time, let's go to the next page, please. Our history goes back to the 1970s when we were part of the Finnair Flight Academy. In the current format, the company was founded in 2002 as the government of Finland acquired almost half of the shares of the company, and the city of Pori became an owner as well. We are mainly an ab initio flight school, while averaging around 100 students in-house, with some 40 to 50 graduates per year. Since we are part of the Finnish government school system, the students of ab initio training program are privileged to pay only approximately 10% of the real life cost of the course. We also run type rating courses for the Embraer Phenom 100 and King Air 300, and have a vast variety of modular courses, for example, aerobatic training, advanced UPRT, multi-engine piston class rating, and so on. We also dry lease simulators and operate taxi flights. And Finnish Aviation Academy is also a member of an International Association of Aviation Personnel Schools, which is called IAPS. We have our own maintenance. We do our own maintenance, and we have a Part 145 and Part M organization. Next slide, please. Here's some pictures of our fleet, which contains 11 Cessnas, 5 Diamond TA-42s, an extra 300L, and 2 Phenom 100s. Next slide, please. We also have a variety of FSTDs for King Air 300 and 200, Phenom 100, Diamond TA-42, and Eurocopter EC-135. And we are purchasing also an Airbus A320 simulator next year for the MCC and jet orientation courses. Next slide. Well, as we know, the pandemic started to show itself in early stages of 2020. But as a school, we were surprised how quickly the situation got worse around the world in late February and early March. Number of infections in Finland was still quite low, and that's why we didn't even think about closing down until the national authorities announced the close down of all government schools in early 2020. Otherwise, I think we could have been would have been able to continue training with some safety assessments and organization of our training. After the close down, there were obviously a lot of questions from students and staff members also. We had to close down our campus dormitory as well. So those students living there had to find another place to live. There were concerns about the delay of graduations, and since the media announced that most of the airlines will be bankrupt within months, they were obviously concerned about the future jobs. Freelancer flight instructors knew that they would not have work during the close down. There were a lot of meetings and briefings, how to rearrange daily and weekly activities. And since distance learning is not available for integrated ATP courses by regulation, we had to make plans how to continue theoretical training. We had to plan substitute assignments for instructors and other staff as well. Our management felt like communication and sharing up-to-date information of new and constantly changing instructions from the national authorities was very important. So we really considered, and we really did a lot of updating of information. Next slide, please. Gave our instructors, the students, about home studying, how to use Microsoft Teams in virtual classroom environment. Theoretical knowledge instructors were standardized how to use those virtual classroom tools. All the course schedules went, of course, down to drains, and there was no way of knowing how long the close down was going to be. So we had to make several different plans for all the training courses for various close down periods. Instructors started to update and enhance theoretical training material and to produce new ones. We had to cancel all FSTD and aircraft exercises to make new schedules based on available information. And during the first days of the close down, we started to perform refresher and harmonization training of instructors. Advanced UPRT instructor courses, class rating instructor and instrument rating instructor courses were organized, and some initial type rating courses as well to train some more pilots for our taxi operations. Instructor updated briefing materials, post holders updated manuals. The close down gave really us a real opportunity to perform activities that normally had been squeezed in within normal work routines and schedules. And we also had a short 2-week layoff period for most of the staff to help the economical situation of the company. Next slide, please. Health and safety has obviously been a main concern in theoretical training. So the instruction social distancing, maintaining high stage of hygiene was a top priority. I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with the hygiene products on the picture. Face masks are being used in classrooms and in other facilities where the distances can be kept. Next slide, please. Over here, you can see the time periods of traditional classroom and virtual classroom activities. The yellow labels indicate normal classroom work, and the blue ones are virtual classrooms. As you can see, for over a year, there was no regular classrooms, only a few progress checks and exams in the traditional classroom environment. And we started virtual classroom operations in April 2020, and some helpful and informative guidance leaflets were luckily published by IATA and EASA within a couple of months. And as you can see from the picture, we are now back to traditional classroom, but also using virtual classroom as a tool from time to time. Next slide, please. So the progress tests and final exams were conducted in a traditional classroom under strict rules of hygiene and safety. We had limited the number of students to 6 in the testing sessions. I'm happy to say that no student was infected during the test session. Next slide. We had no flights in FSTDs or aircraft with students from early March to the end of May. Flying started again in early June with small student groups and very timed intervals. There were strict sanitation routines and instructions how to use face masks. We published daily information bulletins to make sure that everybody felt safe and knew what was going on, and the safety protocols that they were effective. We also had customers from abroad, and they were tested prior upon entry to Finland and also when they were here. The COVID situation in Finland has been much better than in many countries, so that has been helping a lot. Next slide. Slight changes in the students, slight challenges in the students have been due to delays. Some students have already made plans for the work, they return to work, and delayed courses had an effect on students' economical situations. We haven't noticed any lack of motivation in students, even though some students are worried about their future jobs. And the lack of social context is notable, and the youngest courses have not been able to get to know each other as well during the virtual classroom sessions. Instructors in flight had flights with each other and chief flight instructor and harmonizing purposes, and we were able to maintain our ratings valid without using any extension periods. The vaccination and guarantees have only had small effect on scheduling, but nothing major really. Next slide. The feedback from the students and from the instructors has been very good about the virtual classroom. Some students feel like like more vigilance was needed. It was also more exhausting than regular class. But otherwise, very good experiences of the virtual classroom. Next slide. So the lessons learned, further thoughts. I think there is no going back to the good old times with traditional class only. So the virtual classroom is instruction proved its worth and will be used in the future as well. And the area 100 KSA assessments, they probably would be quite challenging to conduct in virtual classroom environment. So that we have to keep in mind. Next slide. For the flight training, the training can be arranged in small groups with strict hygiene procedures. Face masks during flights with us were optional based on feedback and risk assessments. Sanitation procedures are probably here to stay, but not probably to the extent they are at the moment. We noticed that some regular airports were not in use because of the closure of the passenger flights, and spare parts and cargo in general has been delayed due to the pandemic. So the planning plays even a greater role at the moment. But all ATOs should continuously be prepared for the close down and have a contingency plan for pandemic for the future. So I think there will be a lot of flight training, a lot of flying in the future, and we shouldn't be worried about that. Thank you very much. And I'll be looking forward to your questions later on.
Yeah, thank you, Sauli, for also sharing your insights into your operations and how you dealt with them. Specifically, you at some point referred to the less tacit and implicit knowledge. So you refer to the informal knowledge transfer that normally takes place among students. In your view, has this been lost because of the pandemic?
Well, it hasn't been lost, but it's been decreased. So our students interact a lot with each other, and during after the class sessions and in the evenings, they really talk to each other and talk about the things how things are organized over here, and how everything possible. So they have a lot of questions, more questions now than what they used to have, and we have felt like there's a need for tutoring and support, much more need of tutoring and support as before the pandemic, and we've been trying to accommodate that.
Okay, thank you, Sally. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points you also highlighted in your presentation at the end of this session. Let's move on to Carl from the Aer Lingus ATO. Carl.
Good morning. How are you? And thanks to John and Dan for inviting us to talk about the response that we've had in Aer Lingus. We're slightly different, I think, to the others in that we are an embedded ATO within an airline. So all of the training that we do relates to actually training pilots for the airline with no third-party work at all. So if we can move on to the next slide, and indeed the next one. So just by way of brief introduction, Carl O'Neill is my name. I'm the chief instructor at Aer Lingus. I also look after all pilot recruitment. 22 years, 1999, I started flying. Background in business and law, and have flown several types from the 146 to the A330, and presently TRE and TRI on the A320, and also have the distinct privilege of being secretary to the Aircrew Training Policy Group at EASA. So moving on again, please, John. The impact for us has been quite stark. Obviously, back in March 2020, we were hit with quite a severe downturn in requirement for our flights, and since then we have operated at less than 10% of our 2019 schedule, which has obviously meant major challenges for the training and standards department within the airline and the ATO. And I suppose when we look back, we're still in the middle of this, so looking back is quite difficult. However, we are starting to see some very small green shoots. However, we are still quite restricted by government policy. However, we do think that we will see permanent changes as a result of the pandemic, and also some temporary changes, which we obviously will be keen to get back to the ways that we used to do things. Moving on again, please. The key challenges for us was loss of line flying, and when you lose line flying, it's everything we do is to create a great product of a trainee or indeed a line pilot for the line. So when we have such a significant loss of flying, it makes things extremely challenging for us, because it becomes the restriction, because we can't keep forcing people out onto the line when there is no line there. Other things that we're acutely aware of are competency fade across all the 9 competencies that we use to assess and train people. So, I mean, key things are knowledge. People talk a lot about skill fade, which really is scan and manually handling the aircraft, or indeed using the automatics. But we're, I suppose, acutely aware of all 9 competencies, from everything from decision making to communication, because people are just not doing the job day to day like they used to. Other challenges we had on our long haul fleet of A330, we always travel abroad for our training. So with restrictions in travel, it meant we had to seek some extensions, which were really kindly, and we had a great relationship with our own Irish Aviation Authority and indeed EASA to facilitate some extensions that were required, because we simply could not get the pilots to simulators to train. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. And then continually, and as I said, we're still in the middle of this, there still is real uncertainty about the scale up and the return to normal operations as we know it. Everything from how many flights we're going to be flying to what fleets we are going to be flying. We're in a very fortunate position to have the aircraft just behind me there, the A321neo, which is an incredibly, the long range version, which is incredibly an aircraft that really will allow us to use it both on long haul and short haul. So will we require more of them? Will we go back to the A330s? All of this, and how many captains we'll need, how many co-pilots we'll need, all of this is up in the air and presents significant challenges for the ATO within the airline. Next slide, please. So immediately our response included things like moving to the virtual classroom for certain elements of training. So we use Microsoft Teams, which has been an excellent format. However, I do agree with what Lewis has said earlier on. There really is no substitution for having an instructor in a classroom with students. Despite the fact we feel we've done well with it, we certainly are very keen to move back when appropriate into that face-to-face instruction. We had a very significant MPL scheme with FTE Jerez, and unfortunately we had to cease all training on our MPL scheme. We did have a clever mechanism within our MPL scheme, which meant people could escape and transfer into a traditional ATPL route, CPL, multi-IOR, etc. So that we were able to facilitate our cadets through that, and indeed part fund them. We gave some options with respect to part funding them through their ATPL if they wanted to continue. So approximately half our students did that. Others went the modular route, and then others just decided to not train any further. But it meant we had a gentle landing for them, and not just basically cut them without any assistance. We also stopped all of our conversion training. We had several, I'm talking, I think it's about 70 pilots that were between our fleets of A330 and A320. And we just stopped all of that training because, again, uncertainty about where we would need people and the ability to train them with a limited line flying environment. Also, we did everything like everyone has mentioned, masks and hand sanitizers and cleaning of cockpits and simulators and everything. So all the protocols were put in place. And we did ground a significant number of pilots. As I said, all of those who were stuck between fleets, all new entrants who had not completed their line training, and indeed anyone who was what we would call in the restricted flying group, so had actually been checked out on an aircraft but had very limited experience on that. We grounded all of those. However, we did keep the evidence-based training program going for them. So every couple of months they were revisiting the simulator to keep within the program of recurrency. And one of the key things that we tried to do was keep our instructor body more than current, I think is a better way of describing it. We wanted them to be able to react when an upturn does come. We needed instructors to be able to turn everybody on very, very quickly. So that was a very important point for us. And the next slide, please. Other things we just gone one too far there, yeah. Other things we did, we communicated regularly with the trainees that were grounded with webinars, and also with the pilot body. We had different webinars, which we have about every between 2 to 4 weeks, where, like, for example, next week we are focusing, it'll be an hour-long webinar on North Atlantic procedures. As the North Atlantic starts to come back online, we felt it was a good idea to refresh. We've looked at things like unreliable airspeed, topical things that are out in the industry that we feel the pilots could do it. And we've had massive engagement. About 70% of our pilot community are volunteering to show up for some of these exercises. So that's been fantastic. We insist on a maximum of a 2-sector day for lots of reasons. One, it spreads the flying. And secondly, we are finding people are getting fatigued a lot easier than they would have. So we're trying to manage the line operation in that regard. We have reduced operational limits. For those of you that have flown in and out of Ireland, you'll be aware it's quite a windy place. However, we have significantly reduced our crosswind limitations and things like manual landings off Cat 2 approaches, just to, again, ensure that we get back up and running and then reintroduce them. We've restricted some airports to training captains only. We have peer support groups, both corporately, and we have a wonderful group called the Pilot Advisory Group, who are a joint venture with our pilot union and the airline, who provide pilots who are able to help and assist other pilots that are going through tough times at the moment. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're very fortunate to have an excellent relationship with our authority and through that with EASA. And there were lots of extensions available to us. And whilst this was fantastic and we really used it, we did get to a stage that we felt we didn't want to be extending everything for everybody. I suppose you can kind of look at it in a way that if we're flying all of the time, you wouldn't use these extensions. So now we have a pilot body that is not flying all of the time. So why would we continually extend their LPC, their recurrent training, their SEP training, and whatever else? So we made a decision really to not take benefit from them. And that's not to say taking benefit from them is the wrong thing to do. What I'm saying is that in our circumstance, when we sat back and saw the limited flying we were doing and whatever else, we just decided not to take them. But what a fantastic facility, and kudos to EASA and the IAA for reacting so quickly at the start of the pandemic for that. Next slide, please. So our present challenges are still recency. We really our line sector demand is struggling, and again we have to think about how recent is recent. These rules are generally speaking for someone who might have been off the airplane for a while to make sure that they have their 3 takeoff and landings in 90 days. But what if you're only getting 3 takeoff and landings between January and March, and you're only getting 3 takeoff and landings between April and June, and it's continuing like that, and you end up with 12 landings a year? Is that enough to be at the baseline standard that we demand? So recency really is a problem. The other thing is the backlog of our training is growing. We have lots. We have conversion, we have relief command, we have command training. All of these things have stopped because we're just focusing on normal operations. Another thing potentially down the road, which could be tricky, is simulator availability. As everybody spools back up, everybody will have a mountain of training, and simulator availability could become an issue. So we're trying to manage that. And this training mountain I speak about is real. I don't think any of us thought 15 months ago that we'd still be here talking about this as a live problem. However, we are. And what we're finding is not only are more people falling out of recency that require training, we're finding they are longer out of recency, or their PCs have expired, or whatever. So our training is getting longer in that more people are in it, and taller because we also have more training to do. Other problems and challenges that we see is motivation and morale, external forces. People have financial issues, they have marital issues, all sorts of things that come, health issues that come with a pandemic, and trying to manage that in a training environment, even amongst our instructors and indeed management team, is something we're acutely aware of and we're desperately trying to manage in a way. And then another challenge really is the return to work. People have been lying idle essentially for the last up to 15 months. And as they return to work, that's difficult. It's a difficult mindset to actually get up at 4 a.m. and go and fly an aircraft 5 days in a row or whatever else. So again, we're acutely aware of these things and doing our very best to manage those bits and pieces. The next slide, please. Yeah, so some of the opportunities that this has given us, remote learning. So we're doing an awful lot more of that. As I said, we have a desire to go back to the classroom. However, there are elements that could be done via remote learning in the future. We're using Microsoft Teams for management meetings, which is great because I might be in New York on an overnight. I'm now able to tap back into the management meeting on a Tuesday or whatever. So that's fantastic. That's been revolutionary for us, I think. We have moved to online briefings for our simulator sessions. We do a generic one, a video that people watch prior to attending the simulator, and then every Friday we do a Teams call with everybody who is attending the simulator for the recurrent evidence-based training the following week. And that is the feedback from that has been fantastic. So we just show up 20 minutes before the session, gets underway to just check licenses and to answer any queries that the students have. But we're finding they're coming into the simulator an awful lot fresher rather than arriving an hour and a half earlier to have a briefing, etc. We've improved our instructor communication with students in that regard. We also set up a thing called Project Corona, which was ideal. And we wanted to keep instructors involved. And also we wanted to do all of the housekeeping in the training department that we have always wanted to do, because we were so busy expanding our airline that we wanted to rewrite a type rating course. We wanted to do all of this. So I'm delighted to say we kept all our instructors busy and they produced fantastic work. So we really feel like we're in a good position moving forward now. Yeah, and it was a total time to take stock, to sit back and say, we've had a lot of change in Aer Lingus in the last couple of years in training. We introduced our MPL, we went to evidence-based training, and we are progressing towards baseline EBT. So it was a great time to just sit back, reflect, and see what has worked, what hasn't worked, and where we needed to go with the future. Okay, the next slide, please. Yeah, so lessons for us. Pandemics are busy. We really sit there every day and wonder, if we only have a fraction of our airplanes flying, how come we're so busy? But things don't stop. Audits continue. Pilots need to be trained and managed. So all of those things still continue, even though the aircraft aren't actually flying. Safety is paramount, and every decision we make is about the safety of the aircraft and the resilience and effective training that we give the pilots. Another thing is regulation is broad, as I alluded to earlier on. The regulation is written for a wide scope of operators and ATOs and whatever else. And you have to basically decide what is the best way to go for you within that regulation. And as I said, we chose to accept some extensions early on and then not continue with that. That may not be the case for everybody. We've had to innovate throughout this. One really important thing, I think, is we've kept our SOP change to an absolute minimum throughout all of this. We've continually questioning, are we doing it right, and reviewing it and sampling and surveying, and communication is absolutely key. Talking to your instructors, talking to your other members of the management team, talking to the students and the pilot body in general, other operators. That has been really a valuable lesson we've got out of this, is that communicate. And the next slide, please. Yeah, the future. So I can't emphasize enough our view on this, in that now is not the time to be trying to do something different. And now for us, as we scale up, it's time to get back and get everybody back to the baseline standard that we were at prior to this. So to get people back up on a proper roster, flying the aircraft in accordance with our SOPs. So it's not a time for introducing new policies, procedures, methods, anything like that. We simply want to get back up to that strong, safe, resilient operation that we had prior to COVID, and all our efforts over the next 6 months will go into that. After that, it's time to go back to innovation, and perhaps for us pushing towards baseline EBT, etc. But our sole focus at the moment is basically getting back up to speed. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Carl, for providing also very good insight from the perspective of an ATO linked to an operator. I think there were some positive signs, of course, of the recovery mentioned by you there. But it's also good to see that you share some challenges and provided some similar mitigations as compared to the standalone ATOs, let's say. Also good to see that your evidence-based training program worked quite well for you, especially for those grounded pilots, to keep them at a certain competence level. Before we go to a Q&A, because I've agreed with John here that we can use a few more minutes of your time, and the audience is welcome to stay. Also note that the recording of this session will be made available shortly after the session. The questions that we received, we'll try to answer a few now in the next few minutes. Those that we cannot answer, we'll try to make every effort to provide a reply also after this session. So maybe Carl, going directly to one of the questions that has been raised in the Q&A function of this webinar, that was posed by Stefan van Houwelingen, and maybe this question should also be considered by some of the other panelists. Were the extra refresher trainings for students and instructors a big impact on the expected financial costs for the ATO? How did you manage those?
Yeah, well, the truth is we are still managing those, but what we've done is we've let people fall naturally out of currency when we just simply didn't have flights with them. And what we've done, particularly on our long haul fleet, because that has been most affected, we have actually added an additional simulator session at the very least to the recurrent profile. So they're doing 3 sessions where needed. So obviously, particularly with the simulator abroad, that adds massive cost and challenges to us for doing it. But it's the right thing to do. It's not the right thing to do to just throw people into the normal scheme of things when they haven't been flying. So we made our business case, and it was supported to go and do that to make sure that people were up to speed for their normal evidence-based training semesters.
Thank you, Carl. Any of the other panelists would like to also provide a view from their side on this question? Colin?
I think from ATO perspective, in terms of ab initio training, the integrated ATPL, there certainly is a cost. That cost comes in many different ways. Some of it, I guess, for the student in terms of time to complete course. Equally, in terms of refreshing knowledge for theoretical exams, where sometimes that's been necessary due to the full virtual environment. And then in terms of flight training, that has been a cost we've had to bear as and when it's been appropriate and depending on each individual. So yeah, there's definitely a cost. There's definitely been an impact on ATOs. It's just been less aggressive than what the airlines have experienced, obviously, just purely based on size.
Okay, thank you, Colin, for sharing that. I see Lewis, you would like to say a few words as well on this?
Just to add exactly to what Colin was saying, we went through roughly the same things that he went in his ATO, and we also, because we're managing the what's it called, the accommodation of the students, we also had the increased costs of the all the health protection measures that we had to implement, all the jails and everything else, all of those things. What I would just like to reinforce, really, it's the hidden cost for the students that Colin mentioned of the delay on their training. I don't know if everyone got access to the tools to delay their loan payments and stuff like that, but that is possibly the biggest cost that they have, because not only is there not likely as before to be a job at the end of their training, if they spend more time on these full-time courses, they're also delaying the moment they come back into the job market to make some money.
Okay, so yeah, and that's why we have a little visibility at this stage, of course. So it's of course an interesting point to look at further, maybe outside this session. Moving on to another question then for the panelists. Considering the massive change in the general operation, and by the way, this is from Daniel Saraiva. Considering the massive change in the general operation of ATOs during the pandemic, how was this transition addressed and the risks evaluated?
I can come in from our perspective, but probably same as everybody else is through management of change, through risk assessment. So anytime we operated differently is through management of change, and in terms of getting back into operations post lockdown, it was through a thorough risk assessment.
Okay. Anything from your side, for example, Sauli, maybe anything that you can mention on this?
Sorry, can you ask the question again, please?
Yeah, just considering the massive changes in the general operation of the ATO during the pandemic, how was this transition addressed and the risks evaluated in your ATO, for example?
Well, we actually our operation didn't change that much. We had that 3-month period where students were not here, and during that time we did a lot of training for our instructors, additional refresher training, harmonizing training, and as the students came back in early June, our operation continued pretty much the way it was before the pandemic. So we just had safety assessments of some of the operations in flight training and simulator training. but mostly the operation for us was normal, and that's probably due to the situation in Finland and this region here, Pori, where we are located at. The number of infections and has been very low. So we've had a very good situation here.
Okay. Thank you, Sauli. I see, Carl, maybe a few final words on this question from your side.
Yeah, we were certainly the same. Everything we did, every step we took that was not in line with our normal operation would have gone through a hazard identification and risk assessment through our safety department and discussed at what we call the Flight Operations Technical Review Group. So everything, I mean, we're trying to get our instructor training back in classroom from over the next couple of weeks. So I'm actually in the process of putting together a HIRA regarding that, based on good news, which is, lower infection rates in our country and high levels of vaccination, etc. So everything we've done has been, very, very well considered prior to just deciding to do something.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Carl. I see that Lewis also would like to say a few words. Maybe Lewis, you can compliment, and then immediately the last question to the panelists is if you have one positive message looking forward, going forward from now that you can share with the audience on this. So, Lewis, please, you start.
I had just left the camera on. I can jump in on the next question.
Okay,
then.
fine. Yeah, it's the last question. So, if you can share your thoughts on that, yeah.
There will be a return to a form of normality. That is clear. Aviation is not going to go anywhere. We are going through tough times, but we already seeing some of the companies returning to recruiting. Already seeing some airlines even returning and trying to jump in early on the training, and so I think that we still have a tough year, I would say, ahead of us, but there are clear signs that things are turning for the better.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. Then maybe Colin.
I think the positive is the aviation industry is going to come back, and it's a matter of us being patient and holding on as long as we can. And the good news is there's still certainly many more budding, inspired youngsters who wish to become part of the aviation community, who wish to learn to fly. So fingers crossed we can all get through this pandemic together, and our industry can return to the size and shape it was previously, and many more youngsters can enjoy a career in aviation.
Okay, thank you, Colin, for sharing that. Bart, from your side, anything?
Yep, sure. Connecting. Some problem to connect. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sharing what was said before concerning the return to the operations, and I would say it's not about to return; it is returning. I was currently flying a citation for the last few days, and the situation in some FIR seems to be the same as it used to be in 2019. If you go to London airspace, if you go to Paris airspace, and Barcelona, etc. You see absolutely that the airlines are returning to normal operation, and this is a very good sign for all ATOs and all students that wants to become a pilot. So definitely, in my opinion, the future is bright, even if we have to go through some difficult time for the next few weeks or months.
Yeah, thank you, Bart. Sauli?
Yes, Don, I think our students' motivation is still very, very high, and they are really looking forward getting back to normal operations where airlines are keep hiring and start hiring again. And they like the new products that we have been able to produce during this close down, and I think the future for our students is very bright.
Thank you, Sauli. And last but not least, Carl.
Yeah, I it's an old adage, but this industry is completely cyclical. In even in my own career, I've seen 9/11 and two financial crises and an Icelandic volcano. I'd never thought I'd see this, because this is deeper and longer than we ever could imagine. And how quickly we come out of it will be one thing, but one thing that is absolutely certain is we will. And like always, we'll come back bigger, stronger, and quite frankly more resilient, because having been through this as an industry. You know, it just does show the resilience that exists within this industry, because we've had it hard, but I think the future's bright.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, also for sharing that. And if there's anything to go by, if we're looking across the pond to the United States, United Airlines is already recruiting new pilots and already struggling, I think, to get some new pilots. So there is definitely a positive trend going forward. So I think we're coming towards the end of this session. So I hope it has provided the audience today with insight into the various impacts and the challenges faced by the different training organizations being placed in different regions of Europe, as well as having different kind of operations. And I hope it has given you some ideas that you can also use in your organization or during your training. And I think with that, I take this opportunity to thank the panelists, as well as the internal EASA team that has supported the sessions. And I wish everyone a very good day. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.